Hi, everybody. I'm Denis Godlewski, and this is ITPC Eastern Europe Central Asian podcast from the AIDS conference. Well, actually, this is not a live podcast; it's a recording. And I'm here today with Gas Kerns, who is so many things like a legend. He's a trainer, a therapist, HIV activist, and a writer. And we're here on a very special occasion. Thank you, Gus, for being with us. And we're here to talk about NAM. And it's so personal for me because, as I just mentioned to you before we started, it was the first website that I opened when I joined the movement, and my boss told me, you need to educate yourself, go there. And for many of Eastern Europeans, it has been a great resource to educate. Can you share with us what was your personal experience first to join the movement? Like, how did you get involved into the HIV work?
Okay. I first got involved because I got diagnosed in September 1985. So next year it'll be 40 years. I was not, I don't think, in the first generation of activists in the UK. People like, who I can name, Martin Butler, Tony Whitehead, people who founded things like the Terence Higgins Trust. And that's largely because the reason I got diagnosed, tested, was because I'd just fallen in love with some guy, and he just got tested, and he was positive. And then I became his carer because it was a familiar story back in those days of a young man who died of AIDS, and I had to look after him for 4.5 years while that was happening. I had been engaged with the gay community before then. I was a volunteer for London's Gay Switchboard from 1979 onwards, so I was engaged. But really, doing that took up all my time. And then in the early 90s, I started getting ill myself. I mean, I was working in the field of homeless youth, and I was training in mental health, as you have hinted at. But I started getting sick myself, and by 1996 I was pretty ill. I remember reading about the trials of the protease inhibitor drugs and thinking, I've got to get on those. Previous to that, I had not taken antiretroviral therapy apart from AZT very early on, which made me very sick. I was already a reader of what was literally the National AIDS Manual at that point. And people get very confused because NAM was and still is in a way, the name of the organization, of the charity. And that was named the National AIDS Manual because it was literally a book.
Yep.
It was a ring binder
that
you would get printed sheets sent to you in the post that you could then put into a binder as updates, because this was pre-internet.
Yeah.
And they also published a variety of actual books. And I had relied very much on their treatment information. And indeed, we had an AIDSmap dinner, which may be the final AIDSmap dinner the other day, the Monday of the conference. And Keith Alcorn and Edward King, who worked for NAM from 1991 onwards and provided information for me, were there. So that's its history. People get confused, and we didn't help, between NAM and AIDSmap. AIDSmap was the name of the site because nam.co.uk was taken. And really increasingly, as it's become a website with an international footprint and widely read across the world, it's become known increasingly just as AIDSmap. So that's how I normally refer to it these days, because that's how people have got used to it internationally. Now, when I actually recovered from being virtually dead, I realized I wasn't going to die and I needed a job, and I volunteered at a UK organization called the UK Coalition of People Living with HIV. It was the organization for PWAs then. And I ended up editing their magazine, which was called Positive Nation, which was like the UK's equivalent of POS in the States, and very much enjoyed that job. UK Coalition had its own funding difficulties. I left in 2002, but by that time I'd already formed a relationship with AIDSmap, and I started to do some freelance work for them, including writing, or editing I should say, because various people wrote it, a big thick book called HIV Prevention, because I was already interested in prevention. So that's how I developed that particular interest. And then from having been a freelancer, funnily enough, it was, I think, the 2008 banking crisis made me think, oh, maybe I'd better get a paid job, because there won't be so much money in freelance work. I only intended it to be temporary, but then I stayed there till, well, now, basically.
Can I stop you here just to clarify? I'm very interested. Back in the days when there were discussions about prevention that you obviously participated proactively, was there even a dream that there would be a pill or an injection that could help us to prevent HIV transmission? Or was it all about the condoms and some other stuff? Was there a wishful dream, a dream?
I mean, if you were positive, it was HIV positive, it was basically about survival.
Yeah.
HIV prevention was very much, you know, it was for organizations that tried to persuade young people to use condoms and to have safer sex. And of course, that was absolutely what you had to do, because it was the only answer we had at the time. But I had, because I kept in touch with the science, I knew from, gosh, 1999, perhaps 2000 onwards, that it was highly likely that if you were on antiretroviral therapy and it worked, it would also stop you being infectious too. I suspected this. There were a few studies from Africa that suggested it. But there was tremendous resistance, as you may remember, to the whole idea. A bunch of three doctors and an activist from Switzerland came out with the Swiss statement, as it was known then.
Oh, yes.
In 2008. And basically they had decided it was because people were getting prosecuted in Switzerland and elsewhere for not disclosing HIV to sexual partners. They decided this was an injustice. They wanted to make a statement. They said, if you've got well-controlled HIV, you're virally suppressed, and you haven't got an STI, because in those days we thought maybe STIs would make you infectious, then you're not going to pass on HIV. And this was hugely controversial. And it took the partner studies, which reported in 2014 and 2018, before it was really accepted that what we call U equals U was a thing. In the meantime, I'd also heard in 2002, I remember it coming up at a conference in Seattle then, that it might be possible to give HIV negative people pills and stop them catching HIV. And that was even more controversial, because the early studies, the early trials, I think, were designed rather badly. They wanted to try it out in women in low-income countries, Cambodia, Cameroon, and this was regarded as unethical because it was so untried. And I think what they should have done was go straight to the most well-informed and literate people who were basically gay men, who knew about how to sort of take care of yourself in the AIDS era, and they might have got their answer quicker. But in the end, we did get it. I was thinking about this. My first HIV conference, World HIV Conference, was Geneva in 1998.
What is it, like 16 years ago?
Yeah, and there was there was a bunch of drugs that had rather bad side effects. There was absolutely no treatment in Africa, or indeed in any lower income country.
Eastern Europe.
I remember the politicians actually saying it's ridiculous, it's a waste of money, we can never afford this.
Oh yeah, and they can't even say time, so they won't know when to take their pills.
Oh, I remember that one, yes.
Yeah.
I remember a UK minister who I won't name because they were actually quite a good politician, otherwise was saying that drugs for Africa were a silly waste of money. And I don't think even we knew how quickly things could change. I actually interviewed, when I was working at Positive Nation, I took myself off to Geneva and interviewed the then director of the WHO, who was called Gro Harlem Brundtland. And she said, I don't think we'll ever mobilize the funding to get HIV drugs for Africa. She said it would be nice, but I don't think it's possible. Then I interviewed Richard Feacham, who was the first director of the Global Fund, and he said, of course it's possible. And that was in, I think, 2000.
And you were then an independent freelance writer, right?
Well, I was employed by this. No, I was a staff member of the UK Coalition.
Okay.
I was their magazine editor. Yeah. So I was only actually freelance, self-employed for about 6 years, 2002, 2008. I enjoyed it. It was great. But I'd always seen AIDSmap, as I thought of them, as the most reputable organization when it comes to providing people with information. So when the opportunity came to join them, I'd already been freelancing for them, compiling their HIV prevention manual. And I thought, well, yeah, I definitely want to join.
So you joined around 2008 approximately, and it so happens that it's the year when I joined the movement, like as a young activist, and AIDSmap was already digitalized. There was a website, and I remember very clearly the drug profiles that I've studied that were so clearly written and so clear and so understood in a community language, like a language of a regular person, not this medical thing. What was this time, like 2008, when did you join? How was it? What were the priorities and the situation around the AIDSmap?
Yes, I mean, I think back in those days, I mean, already because antiretroviral therapy was working and people weren't, not so many people were dying anymore, there wasn't quite the same degree of funding for community organizations that there had been in the 90s and the early 2000s when nothing else could be done.
Yeah.
You know, you supported people to live as long as they could, and then they died. So by that time, they weren't putting you up in 5-star hotels when you went to conferences, put it that way, which they used to. But NAM was fully, you know, NAM had 35 people working for it in those days, doing all sorts of various kind of projects. There was somebody who concentrated on information for young people and children. There was somebody who, you know, there was a number of different projects. And I was taken on, because of my work at Positive Nation, as the editor of NAM's newsletter, HIV Treatment Update, which you may also remember. And I did that for the first 6 years, I think it was, and very much enjoyed doing that. That was tremendous because it was nice, and I enjoyed this with Positive Nation, even in the digital era, to have a paper magazine at the end of a month, which you could say, this is this month's issue, this is a thing. So I kind of missed that. But really, I mean, we lost the funding to print that, so essentially we went digital. I would like to pay tribute to the then executive director, Caspar, who was not somebody who had a high profile in the world of HIV. He was a very, he was quite a sort of quiet, retiring person, but he was tremendously careful to keep his organization going. And he basically, as long as people like me and Keith and Roger kind of had an idea about what the important news was in HIV and where things needed to go, then he would let us do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on to do several different sort of initiatives for NAM, including getting together the first community statement about U equals U, because there was so much controversy about it, and I basically helped write, in collaboration with people like EATG and AVAC, a statement saying, yes, if you're virally suppressed, you're not infectious, and more or less forcing people to sign up to it, organizations, so that we actually had it's still up there on the website somewhere, a statement from the most prominent HIV NGOs and community-based organizations in the world saying, yes, we also subscribe to this idea. So that's important. That came out in about 2014-15 before the partner study then came out, and then 2016 I met Bruce Richmond, who had an idea about basically turning this into a global campaign, and we devised the U equals U brand. And then basically, I mean, Bruce, I don't have anything like Bruce's energy or his marketing genius. He just ran off with it, and now U equals U has become shorthand for viral suppression and that aspect of prevention.
I want to talk a little bit in details about the U equals U statement, because in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where our audience is, we still hear certain clinicians in various countries saying, oh, but what about viral load spikes? What if the person is not taking treatment properly? How can we recommend this approach on a national level? It's so irresponsible, and the Western world is going to suffer the consequences. It's almost a quote of something that I hear. What would be your response to that?
Well, I mean, working backwards, you only have to look at the statistics to show that the Eastern world are the people who are suffering the consequences, not the West. Viral suppression is still pretty good in Western Europe. It is absolutely true that people in perhaps, particularly in their first year of taking antiretrovirals, some of them do get blips, some of them do. I mean, one thing you do have to remember is that a blip doesn't mean you're infectious. Pretty much, as the WHO has clarified recently, you pretty much have to have a viral load over 1,000 at least in order to be infectious. And these days, a decent healthcare service should pick up on viral failure before that happens. They don't in parts of the world that cannot afford good viral load testing, but more and more viral load testing is becoming properly available.
And this is why the supplies and the procurements of viral load tests are vital, and this is why we are fighting the stockouts in Eastern Europe, because it's hugely important for this particular aspect of your well-being.
Unless you have cheap portable viral load testing, you're not running an HIV service these days. It is so important, and so many studies in Africa have shown you can't rely on just CD4 counts to guide treatment, because people get resistance. You know, if you leave them on failing regimes for a year, they come back with all sorts of resistance, and suddenly they're on the third-line therapy, and it's really wasteful apart from anything else. The other thing is that U equals U is not just a medical statement or a public health statement. It is first and foremost a statement for HIV positive people. Its first intention is to say, don't worry, you're not infectious. If you've got a control viral load, you're not infectious, don't worry about it. It's primarily, more than anything else, intended as a measure to combat stigma and self-stigma. That's number one, right? Number two is to help to persuade people to take ARVs, ART, and stick to it. Number three is its impact on public health. But really, number one is, and always was, this is a single piece of information that we want all doctors to tell people who are diagnosed with HIV so that they don't panic.
You have witnessed so many changes in the HIV world and the approaches. And I remember clearly when I came, the idea was that before a person starts treatment, back in 2008, 9, like you have to do a proper amount of treatment literacy, treatment education, explain what adherence is, and like prepare the patient. Of course, it was because of the resources limited, and HPTN 0.2 was not there back at the time, and all of the data that we have now. But still, going back to Eastern European context and Central Asian context, I still hear this like, oh, now we have moved too far. Like same-day treatment initiation is a waste of resources. People won't understand the importance of it. They will skip, they will have to be switched to the second line. It's going to be a burden for the system, and so on and so forth. And you were there when it was changing from the treatment literacy and education thing to same-day treatment testing and initiation. So how was that happening?
Funnily enough, I wouldn't necessarily insist on same-day treatment as being a standard for everybody. There is some evidence from some studies that show perhaps same-week treatment is a better idea. People sometimes do need a few days to go away and think about it. It's a huge shock, especially these days, whereas, in a lot of countries, thank God, not in Eastern Europe, HIV incidence is going down, including, thank God, in Africa. And so it's becoming, and also it's sort of fallen out of the news a bit. So I think the stigma for HIV has changed. It's no longer stigma based on sort of fear of death and physical fear of people with HIV. It's now more a shame thing. It's like you should have known better, anybody could avoid this. Why were you so stupid as to catch HIV?
Why didn't you take PrEP?
People blame themselves, exactly. People blame themselves enormously. So sometimes I think people need a few days, and there is some data to show, well, maybe sort of a week is better than absolutely same day. For some people. For other people, that's the thing that works, especially perhaps in situations where it's not easy to get to your clinic. So you do need to walk out with the pills in your bag. Okay. It's funny, I was just literally answering someone. I think it's one reason I'm very enthusiastic about the injectables for treatment. I think the ones for the data on injectables for PrEP is just so overwhelming that it needs to be adopted. But the data on PrEP, on long-acting injectables for treatment, is not necessarily that they're much better than oral antiretroviral therapy, but that they remove this burden of having to take a pill for every day for the rest of your life. And I think for some people that is a psychological burden. It's just they get pill fatigue. I was just literally talking to some guy on a Facebook support group in the UK saying, I'm thinking of giving them up. I think my pills are doing me more harm than good. And it was clear that he was just sort of like fatigued psychologically with taking pills. So loads of people saying, don't give them up, but do ask about the injectables. So I think that it's very hard. And it's perhaps a little bit harder these days when you are HIV positive. And suddenly, people are now getting cures, but, so do I have to fail first-line cancer therapy in order to get the chance of a cure? So it's like now, ironically, the hope we see with things like PrEP, with HIV incidence falling in countries where we never expected it to fall, that there is hope in the air. There are two big worries. One, to bring us back to the collapse of AIDSmap, is will the money still be there? Especially post-COVID, when so many countries had to unexpectedly spend a lot of money on that. And secondly, will it just sort of like fall out of people's consciousness? Will it stop being news? And I think those are important considerations, especially also for the funding for science and research.
Yeah.
Because people are saying things like, "Oh, now you've got this thing, lenacapavir. You can do an injection twice a year in your upper arm, fine, and it's like a vaccine." Well, maybe I've myself said it's the nearest thing we've got to a vaccine so far.
So far, yeah.
But that doesn't mean we don't need a vaccine. We do need a vaccine, and the reason we need a vaccine is because we need something that can last years.
Exactly, and I'm also overwhelmed with how media. I rely mainly on media in Eastern Europe, have covered the lenacapavir news, and it was like, HIV is done. And I was like, oh, Jesus fucking Christ.
There's a lot, I understand why, because there's tremendous hope around for this to happen. And I mean, you know, I was in there was a, first thing I went to in this conference was the Cure Symposium they had on all day Sunday, and I was tremendously moved. They had 3 of the 7 people who've ever been cured of HIV up on the stage together. Yeah. Mark, the Düsseldorf patient, Adam, the London patient, Paul, the City of Hope patient. And it was, I was really moved. There were these 3 guys who were completely happy to name themselves, and they hadn't got HIV anymore. Wonderful. But I wouldn't care to go through what they went through in order to get there. So cure is also a big priority, and that may be the most difficult thing of all, because I've always said, because HIV gets into your cells, curing HIV is going to be a lot more like curing cancer than curing a typical disease. But look how far we are getting in terms of curing cancer. We will cure HIV in the end.
Before we look into the future, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the AIDSmap internal things, to the extent that you can say. Like, what was the working environment like? Did you guys have arguments about what's the most important, or was it like more moving in the same direction with a bunch of friends?
I mean, it's funny. I have been in HIV organisations where there are tremendous arguments. I won't name them. I mean, the UK Coalition, where I used to work, that was a tremendously argumentative organisation. People have a lot of passion. People, obviously, if you're an HIV activist, it may mean that you've had a bit of a tough life, or it may mean that you maybe have had to overcome things like addictions or whatever. And it may be that, you know, and you have a few issues. Yeah, I have a few issues.
It's a movement of ideas, and ideas, you know.
AIDSmap, I think it's a bit different, because we were so dedicated to the accuracy of the information we provided that we very rarely had disputes about what to say. I think it's what has happened is very unfortunate, and it's a bit of a sign of the times that other HIV organisations need to pay attention to. But I think possibly we didn't talk about it enough. You know, and there was a sort of AIDSmap. There was, oh well, you know, we'll still be around. There may have been a bit of complacency, so that when a couple of grants went together, the organisation was suddenly unviable. It was a big shock.
I don't want to even start this topic because I'm going to get emotional. So before we go again into that, like, what were your tasks, like as a writer or the part of the editorial of the AIDSmap? Like, how does it work from the internal thing? Like, did you get an assignment from the editor-in-chief? You have to go to this conference and cover this and that topic, or did you select the topics yourself?
A bit of both.
Yeah.
A bit of both. I mean, we always recognised each other's sort of strengths. I had a particular interest in PrEP, I had a particular interest in prevention, and that turned into a more sort of technical interest in things like vaccines. I was the one of the people who could understand a vaccine trial. Unlike a lot of scientists don't understand vaccines. Yeah, I mean, I think it was like, I mean, there was always so many things to cover. You know, it wasn't about it was not a hierarchical organization. There was an executive director, there was an editorial team. latterly, most of us became freelancers, and Roger was the only sort of paid editorial staff member. That's partially because I decided to retire, which and here I am not retiring, but I am and always have been since I got my state pension 2 years ago. I am a freelancer, but no, I mean, that's the thing. It was, on the whole, a very harmonious organisation, and basically, I think I feel tremendous privilege for having worked for AIDSmap because we knew we were good. You know, we didn't have to big ourselves up, as they say. We didn't have to sort of do a big job of promotion. We knew we were held in high respect, and our job was to ensure that our standards stayed that way. And so that was good. It also meant, as I wrote in this blog I wrote, that it gave us a certain amount of influence in the world of HIV to say, look, since this issue is so clear, we need to campaign for it, which is like why I ended up talking about PrEP, because, you know, it's clear if we can make this happen and we can make it easy to take, then it's absolutely clear it will work. And really, everything else is about the practicalities, and even more clearly with U equals U. And so you develop a sense of like what's, and even with the science, you develop a sense of what's a really interesting avenue of research and what may be a dead end. I mean, often I've been wrong, but I've often been right as well.
Do you know the details about how AIDSmap ended up having the materials in Russian on their website?
Actually, don't.
You don't?
I don't.
Well,
do you have a story?
No. I was curious because, you know, when I came in, it was already there, and I was like, wow, that's so amazing.
We always have, I mean, I think it's interesting because there are several other HIV information websites. Certainly, I know the English language ones, things like thebody.com and so on, maybe because they're based in America. I think NAM always had a sort of commitment, maybe because we're European, about getting out information in other languages. The two we most concentrated on, because there's more people who don't speak English who do speak Spanish or Russian. And I think we always felt that we needed to make information as accessible as possible. But Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, French. Those were the sort of 4 core languages other than English that we put information out. Some of that with Spanish, obviously, it's about Latin America. Portugal, it's about Latin America and Africa. French, it was more with French-speaking Africans in mind. And Russia, just because it's, you know, Eastern Europe is over there, and we know that they're reading us.
What do you think of the future? You said you had a dinner, and like, did you guys discuss like, is this website's going to be on, even though with the existing?
I mean, I don't even want to say because I don't know is the answer. I think my personal feeling is that the first priority is to preserve the website because it's a fantastic historical document. I don't think there is any other HIV information website. Maybe there's one that is more scientific repository of studies, but there's no website where, for instance, every HIV conference of any consequence from 1999 onwards is reported, and where the main presentations are reported. We are a big historical document, and because we're not technical, you can trace the history of the way that HIV treatments and prevention has developed since then by simply reading up AIDSmap and following the links. Yeah. And I realized as I was writing, because I've written a couple of reports for other organizations at this conference, how much I rely on AIDSmap to back up what I'm saying. if I'm saying something and I think, hang on, is that true? I'll find a study on AIDSmap, because that's a good shortcut rather than having to comb through loads of journals, because we've already got it there that says, yeah, this is the reference here.
Yeah, I completely agree. You said you've been wrong a couple of times with various things, but you've been quite often right. So I'm going to ask for a look into the future. What do you think is expecting us? What are the most prospective research areas? And I'm not going to ask you, are we going to AIDS by 2030? Because we are not.
No, we're not. I hate that. I bloody well. I mean, I'll tell you another story in which I had some influence. 1990, right? They wanted, UNAIDS wanted to make it 95, 95, 95 from the start.
Okay.
And I remember this dinner. It was the conference at Vancouver, whenever, not the first one, the second conference at Vancouver. When was that? 2015 or something, I think. And I said, you're not going to get 95, 95, 95 to start off with. It's too big. It's too much of a jump. Because at that time, it was like, I mean, it was, countries are very lucky if 50% of their people with HIV were on treatments, and some countries had no access. So I'm in favour of aspirational targets, but I said 95, 95, 95 is mad. You're never going to reach that by 2020, which is what you wanted. 99, and I forget who it was, but somebody from Health Gap came to me several months later and said, they listened to your maths, Gus. It's going to be 1990. Anyway, so, but I have been wrong quite frequently. I think I've been wrong repeatedly about HIV vaccines. I've always thought, oh, this is the one, and then it's not. But I interviewed the guy who did the vaccine plenary yesterday, and Devin Sock, a very engaging and talented researcher, and he's persuaded me that we now know so much more about why it's so difficult to vaccinate against HIV that the pace of research has accelerated.
Okay.
So we may have one by, I don't know. I think we're more likely to have an HIV vaccine by 2030 or possibly 2035 than to have the end of AIDS.
Well, the story of hepatitis C shows us that the treatment's been cured was there since 10 years ago. And what do we have with hepatitis? A catastrophe.
Well, yeah, I mean, there you go. But I also think that the hepatitis C also illustrates that sometimes surprising things can happen. Because, you know, I had friends in the, not that long ago, in about 10, 12 years ago, who put themselves through sort of 18 months of interferon treatment with all those ghastly side effects and terrible depression and flu-like symptoms. And we thought, we're never going to have a drug to deal with this. And the first two actual antiviral hepatitis drugs were pretty ghastly and full of side effects too. Didn't really work. And then all of a sudden,
I don't even remember the names of those.
Cipravir and Telaprevir. Exactly. They were awful. But then it felt quite suddenly, we had a bunch of drugs that worked.
Yeah.
And in countries that do have a decent hepatitis C program, it is there, hepatitis C is becoming a rarer disease. It's certainly the case in the UK.
Yeah. So we have I would not say it's a prediction, it's like a projection in terms of HIV vaccine. So you said...
I mean, unless the money runs out of research, in which case, the world is, we're stupid.
I'm so afraid that this political slogan of ending AIDS by 2030 has put us in the corner of, like, almost we ripped ourselves off financing, because now politicians will have to report they have ended AIDS by 2030, and then...
Yeah, I was never in favor of that one. And even, I mean... one of the one of the most recent things I did for AIDSmap is that there was a modelling study from the UK, and I was actually co-author of the paper as well as reporting on it at AIDSmap, from the UK, one of the countries that has best managed I'm proud to say, from a country that has managed HIV really well, and where incidents started falling years ago, I think 2019, and we've now got more people who have dropped out of care than people who've stayed undiagnosed. That's another big problem, by the way, picking up on the people who drop out of care. Even we weren't going to reach this 10%, 10, 12, whatever it is. Can't remember. They weren't going to reach the UN AIDS target by 2030. Nobody is.
You're in the movement for like over 30 years now in these various organizations. What keeps you driving today?
I don't know. I've often thought about that myself, because I am 68, and I have a partner who keeps on telling me, "Why are you still doing this?" But then he's a doctor, and he's older than me, and he still does his doctoring. He's an anaesthetist, and I think it's that partially it's because some of our social life was built out of this. Partially because it's wonderful to do something that actually feels meaningful, because so many people do jobs that aren't meaningful, and partially because I think I did live through AIDS, and it is horrible, and I want to spare people from ever experiencing that.
What would be your message to the people who are going to watch this video in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, some of whom maybe just recently knew they had HIV, some are activists? What would you want to say to these people?
Yeah, don't be scared. Get your treatment, if you possibly can, by whatever way you can. Remember you equals you. You don't have to worry about infecting others if you're on antiretroviral therapy. And don't let the stigma keep you silent. Don't be ashamed of it. Somebody once said to me, at least with HIV, we know that in 90% of the cases of people who have HIV, they were doing something that gave them joy while they caught it. Okay, that doesn't apply to everybody. People have been raped, people catch it as babies, etc. But in a lot of cases, it's like you caught it because you were a human being. That gives doing something and gives human beings pleasure, and it's okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. I think that's the core message is still the anti-stigma message. It really is.
Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. See you later.
All right.